The sound of my hand on the doorknob was the only thing I could hear, but before I could turn it, a voice shattered the silence. "Stop." My son's neighbor, Jack, stood there, his face pale, his eyes filled with something between fear and guilt. Still, I didn't pull my hand away, even as he took a step closer, his voice shaking. As he finally spoke, the weight of his words sank in like a brick to my chest. "Your son is hiding something from you," he said, and I realized in that instant, nothing would ever be the same. "Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together." David's hand hovered over the door handle, his fingers trembling slightly as he stared at the worn wood. The creases around his eyes deepened, his heart heavy with a weight he couldn't shake. It had been days since he noticed something was off with Ethan. His son had been distant, secretive, and his usual carefree energy had been replaced with a cold, hard edge. David couldn't ignore it any longer. They needed to talk. The door before him wasn't just a barrier to the house. It felt like a barrier to his son's heart, a barrier David wasn't sure he could break. As his hand closed around the handle, a voice pierced the air. "Stop." Jack Thompson's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension that had been building in David for days. David stiffened, pulling his hand back as Jack approached from the edge of his yard, his face tight with something unreadable. Was it concern? Fear? David couldn't tell, but Jack's eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that made him pause. "Jack, what's going on?" David's voice was low, tinged with frustration. "Why are you stopping me?" Jack's gaze flickered toward the door, his lips pressing into a thin line. He glanced back at David, then hesitated before speaking, the words coming out in a rush. "It's about Ethan. You don't know the whole story." He shook his head, as if weighing the consequences of speaking further. David's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What's going on with my son?" But Jack didn't answer directly. Instead, he took a deep breath, his eyes dark with something David couldn't place, and then he said the words that sent a chill down David's spine. "There's something you need to know, but you're not ready for it." David felt his anger spike. "What the hell does that mean? I'm his father, Jack. I have the right to know what's going on with him." Jack shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before meeting David's eyes again. "I can't say more, not yet. Just be careful. Don't push him too hard right now." David's mind raced, the confusion building with every word. "What is this? What's he hiding? You're acting like he's involved in something dangerous." His voice cracked at the thought, but Jack only stood there, silent, avoiding his gaze. "Trust me," Jack added, his tone almost pleading, but his face remained impassive. "I wish I could tell you everything, but not now." David stared at him, the door handle now a symbol of everything that had been left unsaid. Jack's cryptic warning gnawed at him, and it only made him more determined to get the answers he needed. Before he could press further, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Sarah, her face a mix of concern and confusion. Her eyes flickered from David to Jack, her expression softening just slightly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice calm but strained, sensing the growing tension between the men. David clenched his fists at his sides, his chest tightening. "Jack thinks there's something I need to know about Ethan. He won't say anything more." Sarah stepped closer, her hand lightly touching his arm, trying to calm him. "David, don't," she started, but David pulled away from her touch, his frustration bubbling over. "Don't what? Don't find out what's going on with our son? I need answers, Sarah." The words escaped before he could stop them, harsh and raw. His face burned, his thoughts chaotic as the tension between them grew. I know, she said softly, her voice full of the gentle plea for patience David didn't want to hear. "But you're not going to get answers from Jack like this." Jack, now visibly uncomfortable, glanced between them before taking a step back, his face hardening. "I'm sorry, but you'll understand soon enough. Just be careful." His voice was low, almost pleading, before he turned and walked back toward his house without another word. David stood there, his thoughts in turmoil. His hand hovered near the door once again, but now it felt like the door was a symbol of more than just a conversation. It was a gateway to something deeper, something hidden from him, and his son was at the center of it. David's resolve solidified. He wasn't backing down. He needed to speak to Ethan, and he needed to do it now, no matter what Jack or anyone else said. "David," Sarah's voice pulled him back, her tone softening but laced with concern. "Please don't do this now." "I have to, Sarah." His voice was thick with determination. He pushed open the door, stepping over the threshold. "I can't let this go." As the door creaked open, he glanced back at her. Her face was pale, and in her eyes, he saw the fear he didn't want to acknowledge. She wasn't ready to face whatever truth Ethan was hiding, but David didn't have the luxury of waiting any longer. He stepped inside, the weight of Jack's warning hanging in the air like a shadow, and he was certain that, whatever he found, the world he knew was about to change forever. But when he reached the living room, the space felt emptier than he expected, the silence suffocating. Ethan wasn't there. And suddenly, David realized his son was already gone. David sat in the kitchen, the morning sunlight spilling through the window, casting long shadows across the table. The familiar hum of the refrigerator did little to soothe the knot in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His eyes drifted to Ethan's empty chair, the one his son used to occupy, without hesitation, without any awkwardness. But now, every time David looked over, it was like a silent void. Ethan's behavior had become erratic. Strange hours, odd silences, the way he avoided the family, like he was carrying a heavy secret. The more David tried to reach out, the more distant Ethan became. Every conversation felt like pushing against a brick wall. The boy who used to share everything with him had become a stranger, one David couldn't even begin to understand. It wasn't just the late nights or the absence during family dinners. It was the small things, the way Ethan's eyes darted when asked a simple question, or how he always had an excuse to avoid coming home early. It was as if he was living a double life, and David was on the outside looking in. A chill ran down his spine as the memory of Jack's warning echoed in his mind. "You're not ready for it." The words were haunting, cryptic, and now more than ever, they felt like a ticking time bomb. David's frustration had reached a breaking point. He couldn't stand the distance anymore, the silent walls Ethan had built around himself. The father in him wanted to rip those walls down, to demand the truth. But he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt that Jack's words weren't just idle chatter. There was something dangerous, lurking beneath the surface of his son's behavior. He pushed his chair back, the screech of the wood against the floor startling in the stillness. His mind was made up. He was going to confront Ethan. It was time to stop pretending everything was fine. As David walked through the house, the air felt thick with unspoken tension. He found Ethan in the living room, eyes glued to his phone, his posture stiff and closed off. David stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, waiting for a sign that his son might look up, might offer a trace of the warmth he used to have. But there was nothing. Ethan didn't even flinch. "Ethan," David's voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it, the kind that only comes from years of trying to keep it together. "We need to talk." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He just kept staring at the screen, his fingers tapping mindlessly across it. The silence between them stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. David's patience wore thin. He took a step forward, his voice hardening. "Look at me." When Ethan finally raised his eyes, the anger David had been holding back burst to the surface. "What's going on with you? You've been avoiding us. You've been acting like a completely different person. What the hell is going on?" Ethan's gaze hardened, his jaw tightened, and his fingers clenched around his phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice defensive, almost too defensive. David felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "Don't lie to me, Ethan. This isn't just about late nights or being quiet at dinner. You've been shutting us out for weeks. What are you hiding?" Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the floor as he backed away. "I'm not hiding anything. I just need some space." "Space?" David's voice cracked with frustration, disbelief creeping in. You've got a whole family, Ethan. You don't need space from us. You need to tell us what's going on." The words hung between them, sharp and accusatory. Ethan's face flushed, and for a moment, David thought he might actually break down and confess. But instead, Ethan turned away, his voice cold now. "I don't owe you an explanation." David felt the sting of that rejection, like a slap to the face. This wasn't his son standing before him. This was someone he didn't recognize, someone whose trust had been shattered beyond repair. The realization cut deeper than he expected. "Ethan, please." David's voice softened, almost pleading, but Ethan was already backing out of the room, his steps hurried. "Don't walk away from me. Don't shut me out like this." Ethan didn't turn back, just disappeared down the hallway, leaving David standing there, breathless and betrayed. His heart pounded, the weight of it all settling on his chest. The silence was deafening. David exhaled sharply, the anger burning through him as he glanced toward the door. He couldn't let this go, not after everything Jack had said. His mind made up, he left the house and drove to Jack Thompson's. When he knocked on the door, Jack opened it with a wary look, clearly caught off guard. "David, what's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. "I need to know what's happening with Ethan." David's voice was low, but there was no hiding the desperation. "What's he involved in? You've been hinting at something. What is it?" Jack hesitated, his face shadowed with guilt. Then, with a deep sigh, he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your son's in trouble. Real trouble. He's mixed up with some people. Dangerous people. And you've got no idea how deep it goes." David's blood ran cold. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. "What do you mean? What kind of trouble?" Jack shook his head, eyes darting nervously. "I can't explain it all, but you need to get to him before it's too late. You have to talk to him before it spirals out of control." David staggered back, his mind spinning. The truth was out there, but it was more than he could grasp. As Jack's warning echoed in his ears, David knew that the son he had tried so hard to understand was slipping further and further away. And now the question was, could David save him before it was too late? David stood at the kitchen counter, the soft hum of the coffee maker the only sound in the house. His mind was anything but calm. The words Jack had spoken, the warning, the veiled threat, kept echoing in his head. "He's mixed up with dangerous people, and you've got no idea how deep it goes." It was like a knot in his stomach, tight and suffocating. Every time he thought about it, his pulse quickened. Ethan, his son, was involved in something far worse than David had ever imagined. David wasn't naive. He knew there were things about the world he'd been sheltered from, things that teenagers got into when they thought no one was looking. But Ethan, no, this wasn't just reckless teenage behavior. This was something darker, something more dangerous. The fragments of information Jack had given him were starting to come together, but the picture was too blurry, too incomplete. His heart was in his throat, and a cold pit had formed in his stomach as he thought about the implications. He didn't want to believe it, but as the pieces fell into place, David felt the sickening realization settle in. Ethan hadn't just been avoiding family dinners and skipping out on curfews. He'd been meeting with people who had no business being involved with a kid like Ethan. David's mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. His son wasn't just hiding something small. He was hiding a life David had never known about. The doorbell rang, cutting through his thoughts. David glanced up, startled, then quickly wiped his hands on his jeans before walking to the front door. When he opened it, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. Lily Thompson stood there, Jack's daughter, her eyes wide with something between concern and fear. "David," she said, her voice hesitant, I need to talk to you." David stepped aside to let her in, confusion etching across his face. "What's this about, Lily?" She looked around nervously before meeting his gaze. "It's about Ethan," she said, lowering her voice. "I've been hearing things. He's been hanging around with some guys, people who aren't good news. I don't know exactly what's going on, but I know he's mixed up in something." Her words hit David like a punch to the gut. His mouth went dry as he tried to process what she was saying. Lily's eyes flickered with anxiety. "They're bad people, David. I've seen them with Ethan. Guys who look like they're involved in things they shouldn't be." David swallowed, his chest tight. Bad people? It couldn't be true, could it? But as Lily continued to speak, describing vague meetings, late-night calls, and strange faces she'd seen lurking near Ethan's car, it became harder and harder for David to deny it. Ethan had always been a good kid, rebellious at times, yes, but not like this. Not involved with criminals or whatever it was Lily was suggesting. David's thoughts turned to Sarah. She'd been so defensive of Ethan, always willing to make excuses for his behavior, to brush off his lies. How could he even bring this up to her? How could he tell her that their son might be living a double life, one that was dangerous and possibly illegal? David's mind raced, the weight of the truth settling like a stone in his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending everything was normal. What was Ethan mixed up in? And how could David protect him from whatever it was? Later that evening, David found Sarah in the living room, her eyes tired but gentle. She was reading a book, but when she saw David standing in the doorway, she knew something was wrong. "David, what is it?" she asked, closing the book and setting it aside. David hesitated. How could he even begin to explain this to her? How could he tell her that their son might be involved in something criminal? "Sarah, I talked to Lily." His voice trembled with the weight of the words he was about to say. "She told me Ethan's been hanging out with some bad people." Sarah froze, her expression hardening. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was sharp now, defensive. "Lily's just overreacting. Ethan wouldn't do something like that." David's frustration flared. "Sarah, I want to believe that, but I can't ignore the signs anymore. Ethan's been lying to us, avoiding us. He's been sneaking around, meeting people we don't know, people who could be dangerous." He let the words sink in, and for a moment, Sarah just stared at him, her mouth open, but no words coming out. "You're being paranoid, David," she finally said, her voice shaky but still clinging to the hope that Ethan was just going through a phase. "He's our son. He's confused. He's not involved in anything like that." David's heart ached at her words. She was in denial, and it hurt to see her so sure of something that wasn't true. "You don't know that," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't want to believe it either, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine. Ethan's hiding something serious." Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I can't accept that. He's just going through a phase, David. He's our son. He's a good kid." The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears and frustrations. David's thoughts turned to Ethan again. His son had pushed him away, but now it was more than just teenage rebellion. This was about trust, and the truth that Ethan was keeping something from them, something far more dangerous than David had ever imagined. That night, David went to Ethan's room, his heart pounding in his chest. The door was ajar, and Ethan was sitting on his bed, head down, fingers tapping on his phone as if everything was normal. David took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before speaking. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." Ethan looked up at him, his face guarded. "What about?" David stepped closer, his anger building with each word. "You've been lying to me, hiding things. I know you're mixed up in something and I need to know what it is. Now." Ethan's eyes flashed with defiance, his hands clenched at his sides. "I don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice thick with frustration. David's heart sank as the tension between them reached its breaking point. The silence hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, David wasn't sure if he could break through the walls his son had built. The truth was out there, but getting to it was becoming more dangerous by the minute, and David knew that the deeper he dug, the more it could cost them. David couldn't keep pretending anymore. The weight of the secrets he was uncovering about Ethan felt like a rock in his chest, one that grew heavier with each passing day. The cryptic warnings, the late nights, the unexplained absences. It was all leading somewhere dark. David had tried to ignore it, tried to believe that Ethan was just going through a phase, that his son was still the same boy who used to look up to him. But that boy was slipping away, and the man standing before him now was someone David didn't recognize. Determined to get to the bottom of it, David decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't wait for Ethan to open up, couldn't wait for Sarah to come around. The truth was out there, and David wasn't going to sit idly by while his son drowned in whatever mess he was entangled in. He spent the next few days digging into Ethan's life, searching through his phone, tracking his online activities, calling his friends. The deeper he went, the more unsettling it became. Ethan's friends were a group of faces David didn't recognize, people who were linked to shady places, criminal activities he never thought his son would be associated with. His heart sank as he discovered a connection between Ethan and someone named Chris Miller, a name that had surfaced a few times in Jack's warnings. Then, the call came. Detective Angela Hayes, a local investigator known for handling tough cases, reached out. "Mr. Foster," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "We've come across some troubling information linked to your son's actions. There's a potential connection to a crime ring operating in this area. We need your help." David's pulse raced as the words hit him. A crime ring. His son, involved with criminals. The pieces of the puzzle he'd been trying to fit together finally fell into place. But it was worse than he'd ever feared. He wasn't just dealing with a rebellious teenager. Ethan was wrapped up in something far more dangerous. The realization crushed him, his mind spinning with images of his son's face. How had he not seen it before? In the days that followed, Ethan's behavior became more erratic. He was withdrawing further, disappearing for hours, and when he was home, his temper was short. He lashed out over the smallest things. His anger unpredictable and volatile. David could feel the gap between them widening, and with every word that came out of Ethan's mouth, it felt like a door was slamming shut. David's frustration boiled over one evening when Ethan came home after another unexplained absence. David was waiting for him, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed, the anger building in his chest like a fire ready to ignite. He wasn't going to let Ethan slip away again. "Where the hell have you been?" David's voice was low, but it trembled with the weight of months of unanswered questions. Ethan froze, his eyes immediately narrowing, a flash of panic crossing his face before he masked it with defiance. "What's it to you?" David stepped closer, the tension between them palpable. "No more games, Ethan. I know what's going on. I know about Chris. I know about the people you've been meeting. What the hell are you mixed up in?" Ethan's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "You don't know anything. Stay out of it." David's breath hitched. "I will not stay out of it. You've been lying to me, hiding who you really are, and I want the truth now." His voice cracked with the weight of it all, betrayal, fear, and an overwhelming sense of failure. Ethan's eyes burned with fury, but there was something else in them too. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "You don't get it, Dad. You don't understand," he spat, his voice rising. "You're not part of my life anymore. If you don't like what I'm doing, then maybe it's time for me to leave." The words hit David like a slap to the face. Leave? This was his son, his own flesh and blood, telling him he wasn't wanted. David's chest tightened as his son's defiant posture twisted the knife deeper. "Leave?" David's voice was hoarse now, barely a whisper. "You can't just walk away from this. You think running will solve anything? I'll be damned if I let you ruin your life over something I can't fix." Ethan's eyes were wild, his hands shaking now with a combination of rage and fear. "Then stop trying to fix it, Dad. Stop trying to control everything. I'm not a little kid anymore." David's heart ached as the realization hit him with full force. His son wasn't just slipping away, he was choosing to leave, choosing to shut David out. Ethan's face was a mix of defiance and hurt, and David felt a twinge of guilt for pushing him so hard. But deep down, David knew he had no choice. The truth had to come out, even if it meant tearing his family apart. "Please, David, stop." Sarah's voice was soft, but firm from the doorway, and when David turned, he saw her standing there, her eyes wide with concern. She had been watching from the sidelines, unsure whether to intervene. Now, the tension between them, the rift that had been growing for months, was more palpable than ever. Sarah, David said, his voice strained. He's hiding something, and I have to know what it is. No, Sarah said, her voice breaking. You don't have to know. You've pushed him too far already. Please, just stop. Her eyes were pleading, but David could see the tears beginning to form. The anger between them was reaching its peak. The longer David pressed, the further Sarah withdrew, her loyalty torn between her son and her husband. David could feel the cracks widening. The space between him and Sarah, between him and Ethan, seemed to grow with every passing second. He was losing them both. Please, David, don't push him anymore. Don't destroy what's left of our family, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. But David's resolve was hardening. He wasn't going to stop, not now, not when he was so close to finding the truth. And then, as if the universe itself was mocking him, David found something, a note. It wasn't much, just a few cryptic words, but it pointed to something bigger, something he couldn't ignore. The note only raised more questions. Who had left it? What was Ethan really involved in? And with that discovery, David realized this dangerous game wasn't over. It had just begun. David's fingers trembled as he clicked through the files on his laptop. His search for answers had brought him here, to the darkest corners of Ethan's life, places he never imagined his son could be involved in. The more he uncovered, the more the truth became unbearable. The boy he had raised, the one who used to share his dreams and his worries, had somehow become entangled in a criminal enterprise. Drugs, stolen goods, dangerous people. Ethan had been lying to him for months, hiding a web of deceit that David was only beginning to untangle. His chest tightened with each new piece of information, the realization of how deep Ethan's involvement went sinking in like a weight pressing down on his heart. David had always tried to protect his family, to shield them from the ugly parts of the world. But now, the ugliness was right in his own home. The rage inside him flared as he thought about the hours spent searching for answers, hours he would never get back. He had trusted his son. How could Ethan have hidden all of this from me? The question circled in his mind, sharper than any knife. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. It was Jack. David hesitated before picking up, his mind still reeling from everything he'd discovered. David, Jack's voice came through, tight and uncertain. We need to talk. David stood up, pacing as Jack continued. There's more. More than I've told you. Ethan, he's in deeper than I realized. This isn't just him hanging out with the wrong crowd. He's been helping them run things. Small jobs at first, but now it's bigger. This crime ring, they're moving serious product. Jack's voice cracked slightly, as if the weight of his own silence was crushing him. David's hands clenched into fists, his blood boiling. Why didn't you tell me this sooner, Jack? Why did you wait until now? I couldn't, David, Jack admitted, his voice low with guilt. I thought I could fix it, keep it quiet. But now it's out of control. I didn't want to tear your family apart, but I can't stand by anymore. David's head spun as the gravity of the situation sank in. Ethan had been playing with fire, and now he was in way too deep. You should have told me, David muttered through clenched teeth, a mix of anger and disbelief. I could have helped him. We could have stopped this. I know, Jack said softly, the remorse in his voice impossible to ignore. But it's not too late, David. You need to get him out of this before he's in too deep. David slammed the phone down, his mind racing. The anger inside him was suffocating. But more than that, he was heartbroken. His son, involved in something so dangerous. The world. David had worked so hard to protect them from was now threatening to consume them, and he hadn't seen it coming. Later that evening, David confronted Ethan again. He found him in his room, the door half closed as usual, the same isolation surrounding him that had become a familiar presence. The boy he once knew seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone colder, someone who wouldn't even look his father in the eye. Ethan, David said, his voice tight with restrained fury. I know the truth. I know about the crime ring. I know you've been helping them, moving product, getting involved in things you have no business being a part of. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised. His eyes met David's, But there was nothing there. No apology, no remorse. Just a dull hardness. "I'm not doing anything illegal, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice flat, as if he were talking about a simple school project. "It's not that serious." David's heart sank. Not that serious? The man in front of him was nothing like the boy who had once told him everything. "You're mixed up with criminals, Ethan. You're putting us all at risk. How can you downplay this? How can you act like nothing's wrong?" Ethan's shoulders tensed. He stood up, the anger flaring in his eyes now. "You don't understand, Dad. You don't get it. I didn't have a choice. They came to me. I just helped out. It's not a big deal." David's chest tightened with disbelief. "Not a big deal? You've been lying to me, hiding things, making decisions that could ruin your life. You don't get to make excuses for this, Ethan. You have to take responsibility for what you've done." Ethan's face twisted with frustration. "You're making it worse. You're always on my case, and now you're just trying to make everything my fault. I'm doing what I have to do. Maybe if you actually understood." David felt the words cut deeper than anything Ethan had said before. Understood. It wasn't about understanding. It was about protecting him, saving him from himself, from this world he'd stumbled into. But all Ethan could do was deflect, to blame David for not being the father he wanted him to be. "Take responsibility, Ethan," David repeated, his voice breaking. "You can't keep running from this. You need help." But Ethan wasn't hearing it. His voice dropped, full of bitterness. "Maybe I don't want your help. Maybe I'm done with all of this, with you." The words stung, and for a moment, David could barely breathe. The rift between them, the distance, had never felt so wide. Ethan wasn't just defying him, he was pushing him away entirely. David turned away, his mind racing. He had to fix this. He couldn't let his son spiral any further. But as he walked out of Ethan's room, he saw Sarah standing in the hallway. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with disbelief. "David," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "How could he do this? How could we not see it?" David opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There were no words to comfort her, no answers that could undo the devastation they were both feeling. The truth had shattered everything. The family they had once known, where they all fit together in a fragile harmony, was now unraveling, thread by painful thread. And as the full scale of Ethan's actions began to come to light, David realized that the hardest part was yet to come. The road to redemption, if there even was one, was long and uncertain, and David wasn't sure if he could save his son from the darkness that had claimed him. The knock on the door was louder than David had anticipated, each rap of the knuckles like the sound of a final nail being driven into the coffin of his family's peace. Detective Angela Hayes stood on the other side, her face tight with professionalism, but her eyes were shadowed with the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Foster," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need to speak with you. It's about your son." David's heart sank. He had known this day was coming. He'd seen the signs, felt the walls closing in, but nothing prepared him for the crushing weight of reality. Ethan's involvement in the criminal activities had moved beyond whispers and rumors. Law enforcement had now caught wind of it, and they weren't going to let it slide. David nodded silently, his throat tight, as he stepped aside to let Detective Hayes into the house. Her presence made the room feel smaller, as if it were closing in on him. Ethan's life had spiraled out of control, and now the law was on their doorstep, demanding answers. "We've gathered evidence," Hayes continued, her words slow and deliberate. "Your son is implicated in a larger operation. We're looking at trafficking, distribution. The full scope of his involvement is still being pieced together, but it's serious." David's mind spun, the world around him blurring. Trafficking. The weight of those words felt suffocating. This was no longer just a phase, no longer something he could dismiss as teenage rebellion. This was real, dangerous, and it had already cost them so much. As the detective laid out the details, David felt his gut churn with a mix of anger and grief. Ethan had been playing with fire for months, and now it was threatening to consume everything. How could this happen? How could I not see it? That night, David found himself alone in the kitchen. the silence almost unbearable. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation with Detective Hayes. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, that Ethan had gotten caught up in something, without truly understanding the consequences. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. Ethan had made choices, and now those choices had led to a point where David had to decide. Did he protect his son, or did he let him face the consequences of his actions? David's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes red-rimmed, his movements stiff, as if he were trying to walk through a nightmare. When he saw his father standing in the kitchen, he froze, and the silence between them felt like a wall too high to climb. David took a breath, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Ethan, we need to talk." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, guilt evident in his posture. "I know, Dad. I know it's bad. I didn't mean for this to happen." David's anger flared, but it was tempered by something else, fear. He had spent so much time trying to figure out what had gone wrong, and now it was here, crashing down on them both. "How could you do this?" David's voice cracked, the hurt seeping through. "You've been lying to me, Ethan, hiding this criminal life from me, and now the police are involved. What were you thinking?" Ethan swallowed hard, his face a mixture of shame and defiance. "I didn't choose this, Dad. It wasn't like I planned it. It happened." He paused, looking up at David, his voice shaking. "But I'm not the one pulling the strings. I was just doing what I had to do to survive." David stared at his son, his chest tightening. He could see the guilt in Ethan's eyes now, the way his son was unraveling in front of him. This wasn't the same confident teenager who used to deflect and lie his way out of trouble. This was a boy who had realized too late that he was in too deep. Before David could respond, there was another knock on the door. This time, it was Jack Thompson. The look on his face said it all: guilt, regret, and an undeniable sense of responsibility. "I came as soon as I heard," Jack said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. "David, I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. Ethan, he's been involved in this thing for a while now, and I didn't know how far it went." David's eyes met Jack's, a mixture of gratitude and frustration in his gaze. "You should have told me, Jack. You knew what he was getting into, and you didn't stop him." Jack nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I thought I could handle it. But now—" His voice trailed off. "You've got to get him out of this, David. He's in deep, and I don't know how much time we have left before it all comes crashing down." David's mind was a whirlwind. Ethan had gotten himself wrapped up in something so far beyond their control. And now, with law enforcement closing in, David was caught between his duty as a father and his sense of what was right. As the evening wore on, Sarah entered the room, her face pale and drawn. "David," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "please don't turn him in. Please, he's our son. I know he's made mistakes, but he can change. We can help him. We don't have to let the police take him." David's heart shattered as he looked at her. Her eyes were filled with hope, the last bit of faith she had left in Ethan. But David knew, deep down, that this wasn't about hope anymore. It was about responsibility. It was about justice. The weight of the decision was crushing. David felt as though he were being pulled in two different directions, the bond of fatherhood on one side, and the reality of what his son had done on the other. As David walked away from the conversation, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Ethan had made his bed, and now they all had to lie in it. The question remained: could David protect his son from the consequences of his actions, or was it too late to save him from the path he'd chosen? The air was thick with uncertainty, and for the first time, David wasn't sure if the family would survive this storm. The phone call came early in the morning, sharp and abrupt, dragging David out of a restless sleep. When the words sank in, the world around him felt as if it had collapsed into an unbearable silence. Ethan had been arrested. His son, the same boy he had raised with such hope, was now in the system, caught in a web of criminal charges that threatened to undo everything. The weight of it pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. David's eyes found Sarah, still asleep beside him, her face peaceful, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The contrast between the calm of the moment and the chaos that was to come felt suffocating. When Sarah woke and heard the news, the color drained from her face. She was speechless at first, the words too much to absorb. Her world, their world, had just been shattered. Ethan, her son, was no longer a child she could protect. He was now a criminal, and they were forced to face the consequences. The days that followed felt like a blur, the clock ticking in a way that made every hour feel heavier than the last. Ethan's trial began, and with it came a slow, painful unraveling of everything David and Sarah had tried to ignore. The courtroom was sterile, the air thick with tension, as Ethan's fate was debated in front of strangers. The prosecutor laid out the evidence, testimonies, documents, pictures, all pointing to Ethan's involvement in a crime ring far more sophisticated than David had ever imagined. The weight of the truth hit like a physical blow, each revelation about his son's actions dragging David further into a pit of guilt and disbelief. As the trial unfolded, David's mind was consumed with a single question: where did I go wrong? He had always tried to be a good father, tried to guide Ethan, protect him from the world. But now, looking back, the signs were there, hidden in the cracks of late-night conversations, in the moments of silence that had grown between them. David had been blind to his son's descent into darkness, too focused on being the father he thought Ethan needed, instead of seeing the truth about the person his son was becoming. Sitting beside Sarah in the courtroom, David couldn't escape the gnawing sense of responsibility that consumed him. Had he failed as a father? The question echoed in his mind, but it didn't have an answer. He had tried, but was that enough? Was it ever enough when it came to his son? Sarah's eyes were red, her face drained of color as the trial continued. The shock of Ethan's arrest had faded into a deep, crushing sadness. It was as though she was mourning a child who had never been hers. The boy who used to smile and talk to her about his day, the one who needed her in ways that only a mother could understand, was gone. In his place was someone she didn't know, someone who had made choices so dangerous that the very fabric of their family was now torn apart. She clung to a fragile hope, praying that Ethan would show remorse, that he would somehow make things right. But every time the evidence mounted against him, that hope slipped further away. David and Sarah's relationship, once steady, now felt fragile, like a tightrope strung between them, threatening to snap under the weight of their grief. They didn't speak as much as they once had, the silence between them growing louder with every passing day. They were both lost in their own worlds of pain, unable to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Sarah wanted to believe that this was just a mistake, a phase Ethan would eventually outgrow, but David knew better. Ethan had made choices, and those choices were now out in the open, impossible to deny. The community, too, had begun to look at them differently. Friends who once smiled at them in passing now avoided their gaze. Neighbors whispered when they thought David and Sarah couldn't hear, their once proud family now the subject of judgment and pity. It was as though the very name Foster had become synonymous with failure. David felt the weight of that judgment every time he stepped outside. He used to hold his head high, proud of his family. Now he found himself retreating into the shadows, ashamed of what his son had done. Late one night, after another exhausting day in court, David and Sarah sat in the dim light of their living room, the house eerily quiet around them. They had always been able to talk through their problems, but tonight, the silence between them felt like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Sarah's voice broke the quiet. "David, what do we do now?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with the uncertainty of their future. David didn't know how to answer. What could they do? They had tried everything they could think of, and yet their son was now facing the harsh consequences of his actions. There were no easy answers. They couldn't undo what had been done, and they couldn't turn back the clock to fix the mistakes. Ethan had made his choices, and now they were all paying the price. "I don't know," David said quietly, the words feeling like a surrender. "But we have to figure it out. We can't give up on him, Sarah. Even if it feels like we've lost him, we can't give up." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she nodded slowly, as though the weight of his words were too much to bear. She had spent so many nights crying, asking herself where she had gone wrong, what she could have done differently. But the truth was, there was no way to prepare for something like this. There was no way to know how deep Ethan's secrets went. As the trial continued, Ethan's fate began to take shape. There would be no easy way out for him, no chance of returning to the life they had once known. The consequences of his actions were now inescapable, and David and Sarah would have to find a way to cope with the aftermath, no matter how painful it would be. And as they sat there, side by side, the future of their family hung in the balance. Would they ever be able to rebuild what was broken? Or was this the end of everything they had fought so hard to protect? The news had spread like wildfire. Ethan's arrest was the talk of the town, a scandal that no one could escape. David felt it with every step he took outside. It wasn't just the whispers behind closed doors anymore. It was in the grocery store, at the post office, even at work. People who had once greeted him with friendly smiles now avoided his gaze, their expressions turning stiff and unreadable as soon as he came near. It was as if Ethan's crime had become a reflection of David's own failure, and with each passing day, the weight of that judgment pressed harder against him. At night, when the house was quiet, David found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The guilt gnawed at him, but more than that, it was the shame. It wasn't just about his son's actions anymore. It was about the entire family. The community was already turning on them, casting sideways glances when they thought no one was looking, sharing their pity and their judgment in hushed tones. David felt as if he were drowning in their eyes, their opinions, and there was no way to escape it. But it wasn't just the community that David had to contend with. Sarah was withdrawing more and more with each passing day. Her grief was palpable, but it wasn't just the shock of Ethan's arrest that was pushing her away. It was the weight of their family's tarnished reputation. She couldn't bear the thought of their neighbors and friends judging them, and every time she left the house, her posture slumped, her eyes darting nervously as if she were afraid of being seen. The once warm, loving woman David had known seemed like a shell of herself now. She spent more time in their room, alone, refusing to talk about the future, refusing to even acknowledge the rift that had grown between them. Sarah. David's voice broke through the silence one evening as he sat across from her at the kitchen table. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, a constant reminder of the distance between them. "We can't keep avoiding this. We need to talk about how we're going to move forward." But Sarah didn't respond. She didn't even look at him, her gaze fixed on the untouched cup of tea in front of her. "I don't know if I can, David," she whispered after a long pause. "I don't know if I can ever forgive him for what he's done. And I don't know if I can forgive us for letting it happen." David's chest tightened at the pain in her voice. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, the depth of her disappointment. His mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. He had failed them both, but even more than that, he was terrified that their marriage wouldn't survive this. He had tried to throw himself into work, anything to distract him from the emotional storm that raged inside, but it was futile. Every time he walked into the office, he found himself staring at the clock, waiting for the end of the day, only to return home and feel the weight of the silence between him and Sarah. Even when he tried to focus, his thoughts kept circling back to Ethan. The shame was unbearable, and no matter how much he pushed it away, it always crept back. It was a Thursday afternoon when Lily Thompson came to the house. She knocked softly, almost as if she were uncertain of her welcome. David opened the door to find her standing there, her expression heavy with something unsaid. She had always been close to Ethan, had once been a fixture in their family's life. But now, standing before him, she seemed like a stranger. "I need to talk to you," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. David stepped aside, allowing her in, his heart already pounding. She had been a friend to Ethan, but David had seen the way their friendship had shifted in recent months. Lily wasn't the same bright, optimistic girl she had once been. Something had changed, and David couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with Ethan's descent into trouble. They sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Lily spoke, her eyes flicking nervously to the door before settling on David. "I know you're angry with Ethan," she began, "but there's more to this than you think. More than you realize. David's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? Lily hesitated, taking a deep breath. Ethan didn't just get caught up in this. He was manipulated. He got involved with people who knew exactly how to draw him in. I tried to warn him, tried to pull him away from them, but he didn't listen. He thought he could handle it, that it wouldn't get this bad. David felt his blood run cold. Who are these people, Lily? What exactly was he involved in? But Lily shook her head. I don't know all the details, David. He was trying to protect you, trying to keep it hidden. But he wasn't as strong as he thought. The things he got mixed up in, the people he trusted. It was all too much. I wish I could have done more to help him. David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. More? What had he missed? The truth, it seemed, was even darker than he had imagined. Ethan hadn't just been a victim of bad decisions. He had been swept into a world far more dangerous than David had ever realized. As Lily left, her words lingered in the air, a constant reminder that there were layers to Ethan's story that had yet to be uncovered. David felt the weight of those revelations like a stone in his stomach. He had to figure out who had led his son astray, but with each piece of the puzzle, the picture seemed more complicated, more impossible to fix. Back at home, Sarah sat in the same spot, staring at the same untouched cup of tea. The distance between them felt wider than ever, and David didn't know if they could ever bridge that gap. The ripple effect of Ethan's actions was spreading through their lives, changing everything in ways they couldn't control. As David looked at Sarah, the future of their family seemed more uncertain than ever. Would they be able to survive this? Would Ethan ever come back from the darkness he had fallen into? The answers were still out of reach, but David knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, the consequences were far from over. The letter came on a quiet afternoon. The envelope was plain. No return address, just Ethan's name scrawled hastily across the front in his familiar handwriting. David stared at it for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. It felt like a small, fragile thing, a lifeline, or perhaps just another reminder of how far they had all fallen. He hadn't heard from Ethan since his arrest, not a word, and the silence between them had been deafening. David had always been the one to reach out, to try and fix things. But now it felt like everything was broken beyond repair. With a sigh, David tore open the envelope, the words inside written with raw sincerity. Ethan's apology poured out onto the page in clumsy, heartfelt strokes, words that David never thought he would hear. Dad, I'm sorry, Ethan wrote, his handwriting almost too messy to read. I know I've hurt you. I know I've hurt Mom. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm not the same person who made those mistakes. I was lost, and I didn't know how to get out, but I'm trying to change. I'm trying to make things right. David's chest tightened as he read on. The boy who had caused so much pain, the son who had slipped through his fingers like sand, was now acknowledging his mistakes in a way that David hadn't expected. This wasn't just an apology, David thought. This was a plea for help, a cry for redemption. But as much as he wanted to believe Ethan, the hurt and betrayal that had built up over the months of lies and secrecy still weighed heavily on him. How could he trust this? How could he trust his son again? David placed the letter down, his thoughts swirling. The anger he had been holding on to for so long threatened to resurface. But so did something else, a flicker of hope. Could this be real? Was Ethan truly remorseful, or was this just another attempt to manipulate his way back into their lives? David wanted to believe that his son had changed, but part of him was terrified of being hurt again. Sarah, who had been sitting in the corner of the room, watching David read the letter, slowly got up and walked over. She stood silently for a moment before speaking, her voice fragile, as if she were afraid to break the silence. What did he say? David didn't answer right away. He handed her the letter, his eyes not leaving the page. Sarah took it gently, and as she read, David could see the muscles in her jaw tense, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her hands shook as she finished reading. I don't know if I can do this, David, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I want to believe him. I want to believe that he's truly sorry, but how can I? How can I trust him again after everything that's happened? David watched his wife's face crumble as she spoke. He knew how much this was costing her. She had always been the one to protect Ethan, to defend him when things went wrong. But this was different. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was betrayal, the kind that shattered the foundation of their family. "I know, Sarah," David said quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. "I don't know if I can either, but I can't just walk away from him. I can't let him be lost like this forever." His voice caught in his throat as he spoke. The thought of turning his back on his son, on the boy who had once been so full of promise, felt impossible. Before they could say more, there was a knock at the door. David opened it to find Jack Thompson standing there, his face grim. He stepped inside without a word, sensing the tension in the room. "I saw the letter," Jack said, sitting down across from David. "I know it's hard to take, but this could be the turning point. Ethan's asking for help, and he's trying to make things right. But you can't fix everything for him, David. You have to support him, but you can't enable him." David looked at Jack, searching his face for some kind of clarity. "What do I do, Jack? How do I even begin to trust him again?" Jack leaned forward, his expression serious. "You help him rebuild, but you set boundaries. You don't let him back in just because of a letter. You make him prove that he's changed. It's going to take time, David. And you have to be prepared for setbacks." David nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision press down on him. He wanted to believe Jack, but the fear of getting hurt again was paralyzing. He had to be careful, but he also couldn't just shut Ethan out. This was his son. The conversation turned to practicalities. What would happen when Ethan was released, how they could offer support without enabling him, the difficult road ahead. As Jack left, he left David with a thought that lingered long after the door had closed. "Whatever you decide, David, remember, you can't carry him forever, but you can help him get back on his feet." Later that evening, as the family sat in silence, David found himself staring at the letter once more. Sarah was lost in her own thoughts, still processing everything. But there was a part of David that clung to the words Ethan had written, a small flame of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption. But as much as he wanted to believe it, the uncertainty gnawed at him. Could Ethan truly change, or had the damage already been done? David sighed, unsure if it was too late to fix everything, unsure if forgiveness was even possible. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. Just a little. And that was the hardest part, knowing that hope might not be enough. Ethan's return home was nothing like the warm welcome they had imagined when he was younger. The air was thick with tension the moment he stepped through the front door, his eyes darting nervously around the house, as if he weren't sure if he belonged here anymore. The once familiar place felt foreign, like a space he had outgrown, and the silence that filled the room was almost too loud to bear. David watched from the hallway, his heart torn in two. On one hand, he was relieved to have his son back, but on the other, he was overwhelmed with the weight of the past few months, the lies, the secrets, the betrayal. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but nothing had quite prepared him for the sight of Ethan standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face drawn with guilt. This wasn't the son David had raised. This was someone different, someone broken. "Hey," Ethan said quietly, his voice uncertain, as though he was testing the waters. David nodded, not knowing how to respond. He wanted to say something reassuring, something that would make everything okay again, but the words were stuck in his throat. There was too much hurt, too much fear of being hurt again. Sarah stood in the kitchen, her back to them, her hands trembling as she wiped down the counter. Her face was pale, her eyes distant. She hadn't said much since Ethan's arrival, and David could feel the distance between them growing with each passing minute. She had wanted him home, of course, but now that he was here, she wasn't sure what to do with him. Forgiveness wasn't something you could just give out on a whim. It was earned, and she wasn't sure Ethan had done enough to earn it back. "Ethan," Sarah's voice was soft but full of weight as she finally turned to face him. "Do you realize what you've done, what you've put us through?" Ethan flinched at the words, his eyes dropping to the floor. "I know, Mom. I know. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." His voice cracked with raw emotion. And for a moment, he seemed like the child they had once known, lost, and seeking comfort. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of his guilt. He wasn't just apologizing for a mistake. He was apologizing for a whole year of choices that had led him to this point. The wreckage was undeniable. David stepped forward, his voice firm, but tinged with pain. "Ethan, I'm not going to pretend like everything's okay. You've hurt your mother. You've hurt me. But we want to help you. We really do." He paused, watching Ethan's face carefully. "But this isn't going to be easy. You have to understand that. You need professional help. If you want to rebuild your life, you have to take responsibility for what you've done." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes never meeting David's. He had spent so many nights in the sterile, empty silence of the jail cell, trapped in his own thoughts, filled with regret. But now that he was here, he was still unsure where to start, unsure how to even begin making amends. He didn't feel worthy of their forgiveness, but the words came out anyway. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry." David watched him, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. He wanted to believe his son, wanted to believe that Ethan had truly learned from his mistakes. But the father inside him struggled with the constant fear of being betrayed again. What if this was just another lie? Sarah, still standing by the counter, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She had been strong for so long, holding the family together while David fought his own battles. But now, with Ethan home, she felt the weight of everything bearing down on her. She wanted to forgive him. She wanted to believe that her son could find his way back, but the pain of his betrayal was still too fresh. David noticed her struggle, the tension in her shoulders, and he stepped closer to her, trying to bridge the gap between them. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice low. "I know it's hard, but we can't just give up on him. We can't give up on our family." But Sarah's eyes were distant. "I don't know if I can ever forgive him, David. I don't know if I can trust him again." The words were a dagger, but David didn't argue. He couldn't. He knew that trust, once broken, was never easily repaired. The rift between them was growing, and neither of them knew how to close it. As the days passed, Ethan began attending therapy. The sessions were a mix of anger, frustration, and tentative steps toward understanding. He was still lost in the guilt of what he had done, but the process was slow. There were moments when he seemed to make progress, when he seemed to get it, and then there were moments where he would retreat, where the old defensive walls would go up, and he would shut everyone out again. The scars of his actions were still raw, and the weight of the emotional baggage was too much to bear at times. David, for all his resolve to help Ethan, was battling his own demons. He wanted to believe in his son, wanted to be the father who could guide him through this, but the self-doubt was creeping in. Had he failed Ethan? Had he failed Sarah? The questions gnawed at him, and every time Ethan seemed to pull away, David wondered if he was truly doing enough. Meanwhile, Sarah became more distant, not just from Ethan, but from David as well. The strain was becoming unbearable, and the silence between them felt like an impenetrable wall. David could feel her slipping away, unable to fully forgive Ethan, and unsure if their marriage could survive the weight of everything that had happened. But David refused to give up. He couldn't. Not when there was still a chance for Ethan to change, not when there was still a chance to heal what was broken. The family had started to take small, hesitant steps toward healing, but it was clear they had a long way to go. And as David sat in the quiet of their home, watching Ethan try, watching Sarah struggle, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. How could they move forward when the damage ran so deep? How could they rebuild when everything had been torn apart? Ethan's journey was only just beginning, and David could only hope that it wasn't too late for all of them. Ethan had always been a dreamer, a young man full of promise, but now the boy who had once been filled with hope was struggling to rebuild a life that had been shattered. His days had become an exhausting cycle of therapy sessions, self-reflection, and an overwhelming sense of guilt that seemed to cling to him no matter how hard he worked to shake it off. The path to redemption wasn't just about getting his life back. It was about earning back the trust he had broken, and that was a far harder task. David watched Ethan with a mixture of pride and doubt. The boy who had once defied him at every turn was now showing up to therapy without being told, sitting in the uncomfortable silence of his own feelings and pushing through the painful process of looking at his mistakes. It wasn't easy. Ethan had moments of frustration, moments when he wanted to quit, to slip back into the comfortable numbness of denial. But there was something different about him now, a glimmer of determination buried beneath the layers of regret. David could see it, even if it was only visible in the small, everyday actions. Ethan was trying, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. David had learned to be more patient with his son. The anger that had burned so hotly just months ago had cooled into something more measured, more thoughtful. He realized that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a switch that could be flipped, but a slow and steady process that required both time and trust. His heart still ached for the boy he once knew, and the boy he was now had a long way to go. But as each day passed, David found himself letting go of the past, if only just a little, and allowing room for hope to take root. Sarah, however, was still tentative. Her wounds were fresh, her trust still broken. She watched from the sidelines, her emotions torn between a fierce desire to forgive and the painful reality of what Ethan's actions had cost them. She still couldn't quite reconcile the boy she had loved with the man who had made such disastrous choices. It was as if the distance between them had become a permanent fixture in their home, a wall she didn't know how to break down. But there were moments, small, quiet moments, when Sarah would catch herself softening, when she would catch Ethan trying to help around the house or engage in a conversation with David, and a flicker of the boy she had once known would appear, the one she could trust. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, not yet, but it was a start. She didn't know how to forgive him fully, but the idea was slowly growing in her, like a seed that needed time to sprout. David could see the change in Sarah, too. She was still guarded, still hesitant to open her heart completely, but he sensed her willingness to try. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, that there would be setbacks, but for the first time in months, David allowed himself to believe that forgiveness was possible, that their family, though scarred, might find a way to heal. One evening, Jack Thompson showed up unexpectedly. He had always been a friend to the family, but now he was more of a lifeline for Ethan. "I've got something for you," Jack said, his voice warm but firm. He handed Ethan a slip of paper, a job offer from a local warehouse where Jack had connections. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "This is your chance, Ethan," Jack added, his eyes locking with the young man's. "You've been given a second chance, and you've got to make the most of it. No more excuses." Ethan stared at the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. It was the first step towards something real, something he could build on. The idea of earning his way back, of proving that he could stand on his own 2 feet, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks, Jack," Ethan said, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. The first few weeks on the job were tough. Ethan was exhausted, physically and mentally drained. His body ached from the long hours, and the work was repetitive, far from the dreams he had once had. But it didn't matter. For the first time in months, Ethan felt like he was doing something right. Every small victory, every shift completed, every paycheck earned, added a little more weight to the fragile foundation he was trying to build. As he started working, he also began reaching out to old friends, trying to repair the relationships he had damaged. It wasn't easy. Some of them didn't want anything to do with him, their trust too shattered to rebuild. But there were others who were willing to listen, to give him a chance to show that he had changed. It was a slow process. And not everyone was willing to forgive him, but Ethan wasn't giving up. He couldn't. At home, David often found himself reflecting on his role in all of this. He had always tried to be a good father, but now, in the quiet of the evenings, when the house was still and Sarah was lost in her own thoughts, David couldn't help but question where he had gone wrong. Had he missed the signs? Had he been too lenient, too forgiving when he should have been more firm? He had spent years trying to protect his son, but in doing so, had he failed to prepare him for the world outside? The thought was haunting, but it was one that David couldn't shake. He had always believed he could fix things, that he could guide Ethan through every mistake, but now he realized that some things couldn't be fixed with just love and guidance. Some things took time, more time than he was prepared for. The family had begun to take tentative steps toward healing. There were moments of peace, moments where they sat together at dinner, where laughter filled the air, and for a brief moment, they could pretend that everything was okay. But David knew the road ahead was still uncertain. There was still so much to be repaired, so many scars to heal. Ethan was changing, but the past couldn't be erased, and neither could the weight of what had happened. As Ethan sat at the kitchen table one evening, his hands calloused from work, his eyes tired but determined, David couldn't help but wonder, could they truly rebuild everything that had been lost? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as the family continued their journey down the long road of redemption. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft clink of coffee mugs being set on the kitchen counter. It was a rare moment of stillness in the chaos that had become their life, and David felt the weight of it settle around him like a heavy blanket. He had spent months avoiding the conversation he knew they needed to have. But now, as Sarah stood there, her eyes tired and distant, he realized there was no more running from it. It was time to confront everything, the hurt, the fear, the pain, and try to understand how they could move forward. Sarah took a seat at the table, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her coffee mug, a hesitant silence between them. David sat down across from her, searching her face for the words they both needed, but didn't know how to say. There had been so many unspoken emotions, so many things left unsaid between them. The last few months had been a whirlwind of anger and confusion, but now, in this quiet moment, it felt like the calm before a storm. "Sarah," David began softly, his voice unsteady as he met her gaze. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to forgive him, or if I even can." The words felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, but they were real, raw, an admission of the deep ache inside him. Ethan's betrayal had cut deeper than he ever anticipated, and the road to healing was a long one. He couldn't just forgive and forget. The damage wasn't something you could erase with a few kind words. Sarah didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him, the years of pain and disappointment reflected in her eyes. "I don't know either," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's so hard. David, I want to believe him. I want to believe he's changing, that he's sorry for what he did. But I don't know how to trust him again. How can I trust that he won't hurt us again?" David felt the truth of her words settle in his chest. How could they trust Ethan again? It wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a pattern of lies, a history of broken promises. But sitting there, in the quiet of the kitchen, David realized that trust wasn't something that could be given all at once. It was something that had to be earned, slowly, with every effort, every step forward. I think we have to try, Sarah," David said, his voice softer now. "I've been so angry. I've been holding on to this anger, this frustration, but holding on to it is only hurting us more. I can't keep doing this." He paused, his eyes searching hers. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what he did. It's about letting go of that weight. It's about moving forward. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She was still scared, still unsure if she could ever fully forgive Ethan. But in that moment, David saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a willingness to try, to take the first steps toward healing. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. Ethan, for his part, had been doing everything he could to make amends. He had started therapy, not as an obligation, but because he knew it was the only way to face the demons he had buried for so long. He had reached out to people he had wronged, friends, family, and apologized, each conversation more difficult than the last, each apology carrying the weight of everything he had put them through. There were still moments when the shame overwhelmed him, when he wanted to run away from the consequences, but he kept going. He kept working. He kept showing up. David had watched him with a mix of cautious hope and lingering doubt. Ethan had begun to rebuild his reputation, one small act at a time, offering a sincere apology, helping around the house, staying sober, and, most importantly, taking full responsibility for his actions. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when Ethan slipped back into old habits, but David could see the effort, the sincerity in his son's eyes. That was something. As the days passed, Sarah began to soften, though her trust was fragile, like glass that had been shattered and pieced back together. She was still cautious, still holding a part of herself back, but she was trying. She would smile at Ethan when he helped clean up the kitchen or offered to run errands for her. She would pat his shoulder as he passed, a small gesture that said, "I'm still here. I'm trying." David, too, had begun to let go of some of his anger. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, felt suffocating. But he realized that holding on to that anger wasn't just hurting Ethan, it was hurting him, too. The pain was eating him up inside. He had spent so long wanting revenge, wanting to make Ethan feel the weight of what he'd done. But now he understood that forgiveness wasn't just for Ethan. It was for them. It was for their family. And so, slowly, over time, David allowed himself to believe again, to trust, not fully, but in small ways. He took the first tentative steps toward rebuilding the bridge between them. That evening, they all sat down for dinner, a simple meal of pasta and salad. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a small victory, but it was progress. Ethan, though still fragile, seemed at ease for the first time in a long while. The silence between them was no longer heavy with judgment, but filled with the tentative hope of something better. As they ate, Sarah caught David's eye across the table. Her gaze softened, and for the first time in months, they shared a small, quiet smile. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the resolution they had hoped for, but it was enough. For now. David didn't know if their family would ever be the same, but he knew that, for the first time in a long while, they were on the path to something new, something better. The journey was far from over, but they were taking the first steps toward healing, and that, at least, was something worth holding on to. But even as they shared this fragile peace, David couldn't shake the question that lingered. Would this fragile trust hold, or would the weight of the past break them again? The phone call came late on a Wednesday evening, the kind of call that you know will change everything the moment you hear it. David stood by the window, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him even before the voice on the other end finished speaking. Ethan's past was finally catching up to him. It had been months since his release from jail, months of therapy, small victories, and quiet moments of hope. Ethan had worked so hard to rebuild his life, and for a moment, it seemed like they were finally on the right path. But that old darkness, the one he had tried to outrun, was knocking at their door once again. "David," the voice of Detective Hayes came through the phone, her tone serious. "We've found new evidence. Ethan's involvement in the criminal activities isn't over. There's more, and we're moving forward with charges. It's happening." David felt the floor drop beneath him. His son's past was threatening to swallow him whole, and for the first time, David had to confront a painful truth. He couldn't protect Ethan from everything. This wasn't just about forgiveness anymore. This was about a legal system that demanded justice, and a boy who had to pay the price for the choices he made. Ethan's face, once filled with the shadows of guilt, was now full of fear as he sat across from David in their living room, the news still hanging between them like an unspoken question. His hands were clenched in his lap, his eyes locked on David's with a mixture of desperation and sorrow. "Dad, I didn't do this. I swear I didn't," he pleaded, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for, after everything they had worked through together. But the truth was staring him in the face, and there was no denying it. His son's past wasn't going to let him move on without consequences. "Ethan," David began, his voice rough with emotion, "you have to take responsibility for what you've done. You've been given a second chance, and now it's time to face the music. It's the only way forward. You can't keep running from your past." Ethan's face twisted with the weight of that truth. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it, defeated. He had come so far, fought so hard to rebuild his life, but he knew, deep down, that this moment was inevitable. The life he had lived, the mistakes he had made, couldn't be erased. "I know," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been trying, Dad, but I'm still not done. I don't know how to fix this, but I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes." His words were sincere, but David could see the weight of them breaking him. David felt a tug at his heart. This was his son, the boy he had raised, the boy he had watched make so many mistakes. He loved him, wanted to protect him. But this was different. This was no longer just about love. It was about growth. It was about Ethan accepting responsibility for the things he had done and learning to live with the consequences, no matter how hard it was. He turned his gaze to Sarah, who had been listening quietly from the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with the same mix of fear and grief that had been etched into David's heart for so long. This was the moment they had both feared, when the past would come back to claim their son. "I don't want to lose him, David," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want him to go back to that place. He's changed. He's trying." David's heart ached at the sound of her voice. He could feel the pull of her love for Ethan, the same love that made it so difficult for her to let go, to let Ethan face the consequences of his actions. But David knew, deep inside, that this was the only way. They couldn't protect him forever. "Sarah, I know," David said, his voice gentle but firm. "But he has to learn. If we keep saving him, we're not helping him. We're enabling him. He has to face what he's done. It's the only way he'll move on." For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of their shared fear pressing down on them. But finally, Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want to lose him, but I know you're right. We can't keep sheltering him. He has to face this." David's chest tightened as he watched Ethan, his son's face a mask of pain and regret. "I'll be here for you, Ethan," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always be here, but you have to do this. You have to stand up and take responsibility. That's the only way we can heal." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I understand, Dad," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to make things right." As the days passed, David and Sarah faced the reality that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. They couldn't undo what had been done, and Ethan couldn't erase his past. But they could move forward. They could choose to support him, to help him rebuild his life, even if it meant enduring more pain along the way. When the time came for Ethan to face the justice system, David was right there beside him. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, they were a family. Broken, but not beyond repair. Ethan's journey was far from over, and the consequences of his past would follow him for a long time. But as they stood together, facing the future, David knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, they would face it as a family. The question remained, though, would Ethan ever be truly free of the past, or would it continue to haunt him forever? The months following Ethan's sentencing were long and quiet. The courtroom drama had ended, the judgment made, and now they were left with the slow and painful task of picking up the pieces. Ethan had been given a chance to rebuild his life, and the weight of that responsibility was not lost on him. Though no longer under legal scrutiny, the emotional scars were just as real, perhaps even deeper. Each day felt like a step in the right direction, but also a reminder of everything that had been lost. Ethan worked tirelessly to repair his relationships, starting with the ones closest to him. He had to earn back the trust of his family, his friends. He had to prove that the man he had become was someone worth believing in. But there were moments in the quiet of the night when he would lie awake and wonder if it was too late, if the damage was too deep to ever truly undo. David could see the effort. He saw it in the way Ethan spoke to people now, how he took accountability without flinching, how he showed up every day, trying to be the man he had once hoped to become. But it wasn't enough to erase the past, not yet. Ethan wasn't a perfect son, he never would be, but he was trying. And that, at least, was something. David had never realized how much he had taken for granted in their family. How easy it had been to love and protect Ethan when things were smooth. But the cracks, the ones they had ignored, had deepened. and now the work to mend them seemed impossible. Still, he was determined. The work wasn't just about Ethan. It was about him and Sarah, too. They had to heal together, as a couple, as parents, or this would all be for nothing. Sarah had been quiet through most of it, retreating into herself, weighed down by the guilt of wondering if she had missed something, if she could have done more. But now, as Ethan began to make his own way forward, Sarah started to open up. There were moments when she would catch David's eye across the room, and for the first time in months, there was no bitterness, no silent judgment, just a quiet understanding. They were both still hurting, but they were also still here, still trying. And that meant something. It wasn't always easy. Some nights the silence between them was suffocating, but they had come to realize that silence wasn't always a bad thing. It was a space where they could work through their pain, talk through their fears, and find a new way to move forward together. As for Ethan, he had started a new chapter in his life, one he never could have imagined when he was facing down his darkest days. He had begun mentoring others, people who had made mistakes like his, people who had been lost, who had found themselves at the mercy of their own choices. Ethan used his own story to show them that there was a way out, that change was possible, even after everything seemed broken. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't perfect, but he was learning. And in helping others, he was learning how to help himself. But even as Ethan took steps to rebuild his reputation, the shadow of his past loomed large. There were people who still couldn't forgive him, who still saw him as a criminal, as a lost cause. It hurt more than he let on. The hardest part wasn't the people who hated him. It was the people who had once loved him, but now looked at him with disappointment. That was the pain that stayed with him, the one that never seemed to go away. The family had begun to spend more time together. There were no big celebrations, no grand gestures, but they were present for one another in the little ways. Family dinners, walks around the neighborhood, quiet evenings in the living room. They didn't need words to fill the space anymore. The healing wasn't perfect, but it was happening. Slowly and with caution, but it was happening. David had moments of reflection, watching Ethan from the kitchen window as he worked outside, his back hunched in concentration. The boy who had once made him so angry, who had broken his heart more times than he cared to admit, was now doing everything he could to make things right. And David knew that this was the hardest thing to accept. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain, but it allowed them to move forward, to build something new, even if it was fragile. David realized in those quiet moments of reflection that love wasn't simple. It wasn't easy. It was complicated, messy, full of contradictions. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting for. And that was the lesson Ethan had taught him in ways he couldn't have imagined when they were in the darkest part of their journey. You don't give up on the people you love. You don't turn your back, no matter how hard it gets. As the family sat together that evening, Ethan helping Sarah clear the table, David saw it, the slow but steady progress. There were still scars, still broken pieces, but they were no longer just remnants of the past. They were part of the story, part of the journey. David turned to Sarah, meeting her eyes across the table. She gave him a small, soft smile. For the first time in months, it wasn't forced. It was real. And in that moment, David understood. This wasn't just about Ethan finding his way. It was about their whole family finding a new path, together. But even as they celebrated the small victories, David couldn't shake the feeling that the road ahead was still long. Ethan had made progress, but there was still so much more to do. The journey was far from over. And as David looked at his son, he knew that the hardest part of all was yet to come. Ethan stood at the door of the small, nondescript office building, his heart pounding in his chest. The door wasn't just a threshold to a new job. It felt like a doorway to a new life. It had been months since he'd left the confines of his past, and even now, the weight of his mistakes pressed on him. But this was different. Today, he wasn't walking into a world of excuses or hidden regrets. Today, he was stepping forward, taking ownership of his life for the first time. The job wasn't glamorous. It was a warehouse position. Physical labor, long hours, but it was honest work that meant something. And it was his. Ethan had been determined to find something, to prove to himself and to his parents that he was capable of making something of his life. The interview had gone well, and after a few nerve-wracking days, the call had come through. He had the job. As he entered the building, the smell of fresh paint and the faint hum of machinery welcomed him. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief. This was a beginning. This wasn't just about earning a paycheck. This was about showing the world and himself that he was capable of doing better. He wasn't running anymore, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe again. David and Sarah, though still wary, watched their son with a mix of pride and caution. They had seen this moment coming, the chance for Ethan to prove himself, but the scars of the past were still fresh. Ethan's journey was far from over, and while they celebrated his progress, both David and Sarah knew that the road ahead was uncertain. The trust that had been broken couldn't be fixed in a single day, but seeing him take these first steps, seeing him make an effort for the first time, gave them hope. It had been months since they'd sat together like this, in the warmth of the kitchen, just the three of them, sharing a quiet meal. The tension that had once lingered in every conversation had loosened, but the unspoken weight of the past was still there, hovering in the background. As they passed the plates around the table, David caught Sarah's eye across the room, and for a moment, the silence between them felt full of understanding, something they hadn't had in a long time. "We're getting there, aren't we?" Sarah said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words weren't just about Ethan. They were about them, about their family, about the quiet work they had done on their relationship too. David nodded, his own thoughts drifting to the months of struggle. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are. It's not easy, but it's worth it." His eyes flickered to Ethan, who was sitting quietly, the weight of his past still visible in his eyes, but also a quiet determination. "I'm proud of you, son," David added, his voice a mix of pride and uncertainty. "I know this hasn't been easy, but you're doing it." Ethan's gaze met his father's, a flicker of gratitude there, but also something deeper, something still raw. "Thanks, Dad. I'm trying. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'll get there. I won't stop." For Sarah, hearing those words was both a relief and a reminder of just how much trust had been lost. She wanted to believe in him, wanted to see the son she had once known emerge from the shadows of his past, but the hurt still lingered. It was hard to let go of the anger, the disappointment, the betrayal, but there was something in Ethan's voice, something honest, that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe this time things would be different. After dinner, the family sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the room. There was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before, a quiet understanding that they were, for the first time in months, beginning to heal. Ethan had made mistakes, but so had they. They had all failed each other in different ways, but they were here now, together, and that was what mattered. David looked at Sarah, his heart full of gratitude. They had both endured so much, the emotional strain, the sleepless nights, the constant worry, but they were still standing, and that was something worth holding on to. He knew that their relationship wasn't perfect, that trust would take time to rebuild, but they were finding their way again. Slowly, they were learning to listen to each other, to communicate in ways they hadn't in years. Ethan, too, was finding his way back to his parents, though the road was rocky. There were still moments when the weight of his past decisions would catch up with him, when the regret would hit like a tidal wave. He wasn't the same person he had been before his arrest, and he knew that, but he also knew he wasn't the person he had been when he walked into the courtroom either. He had changed. He had to. And as much as he wanted things to go back to how they were, he knew that wasn't possible. The past was gone, and the only thing left to do was keep moving forward. "I know I've hurt you both," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to make things right. I hope you can trust me again." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand, her eyes softening. "It's going to take time, Ethan, but we'll get there. We'll get through this. Together." As they sat there, the weight of the past still looming over them, there was a quiet sense of peace in the room. It wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. They had come through the hardest part, but the road ahead was still long. Trust was still fragile, but they had each other, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Ethan's new job, his renewed efforts to rebuild, had given him a sense of purpose, but deep inside, he knew this was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead, one filled with setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But as he looked at his parents, as they sat there, trying to find their way back to each other, he felt a glimmer of hope. Change was possible. Redemption was possible. And he was ready to fight for it. But even as they began to heal, a question lingered in the air. Would they ever truly leave the shadows of the past behind, or would they always be haunted by what had happened? The warm summer evening settled around the family like a blanket as they gathered together on the porch of the old house. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the silence between them. The once worn wooden chairs creaked under the weight of time, just as their hearts had, yet there was a quiet strength in the way they now sat together. The journey they had taken, through pain, betrayal, and healing, had brought them here. They had made it to this moment, a moment where the scars of the past, while still visible, no longer dictated the way they moved forward. David glanced at Sarah beside him, her hand gently resting in his. There were still traces of the grief they had carried together, the quiet fears they had never spoken aloud. But now, as they looked at their son across the porch, there was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had weathered the storm. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and David could see it in her gaze, the realization that, against all odds, they had come through, together. Ethan sat across from them, now a young man, mature, calm, and grounded in a way that felt worlds apart from the reckless, angry boy who had once thrown his future away. He had grown, changed, not because of anyone else's expectations, but because of the work he had put in himself. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was progress, and for that, David and Sarah were proud. "Look at you," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet pride, though the years of struggle still lingered in her words. "I'm so proud of the man you've become, Ethan." Her voice cracked just slightly, betraying the emotion that had built up over the years. "You've come so far. I never thought we'd get here, but here we are." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. The weight of his transformation, the weight of everything that had brought him to this point, was evident in his gaze. There was a humility there, the kind that only comes from hard-earned wisdom. He was different now, calmer, quieter, more deliberate. But still, the rawness of his past was never far from the surface. "Mom, Dad," Ethan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for everything you did, for not giving up on me. I know it wasn't easy. I know I made it harder than it ever had to be." He paused, glancing at his parents, the depth of his gratitude in his eyes. "But if it weren't for you, if it weren't for your love, your support, there's no way I'd be here today. You gave me the chance to turn things around, even when I didn't deserve it. And for that, I can never thank you enough." David felt a lump form in his throat, the words Ethan had spoken stirring up emotions he'd buried for years. He had never expected his son to apologize so deeply, or to take full responsibility for the pain he had caused. It wasn't something David had ever forced on him, but hearing Ethan speak those words, the weight of their meaning, brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah squeezed David's hand. She didn't say anything, but there was an understanding in the way she held his gaze. It wasn't just that Ethan had changed. It was that they had all changed. They had learned to forgive each other, to accept the past without letting it define their future. David cleared his throat, finding his voice at last. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" he said, his words soft but firm. "But you know, Ethan, watching you come back from everything, it's the hardest thing I've ever done, and the most rewarding. I've seen you struggle, seen you fight for this life you're building. And I've learned, too, that forgiveness isn't something that just happens. It's something we have to work at, every day." His voice caught for a moment as he glanced at Sarah. But we've worked through the hardest part together, and we're still here. Ethan nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had made so many mistakes, hurt so many people along the way. But in this moment, with his parents beside him, he felt like the person he was now was enough. You've taught me that, Ethan said, his voice low but strong. You've taught me that forgiveness isn't just about saying sorry. It's about showing up every single day and proving that you've learned from the past. He paused, glancing down at his hands before meeting their eyes again. And that's what I'll keep doing. I'll keep showing up, for myself and for you. The family fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need words. They were no longer the same people they had been years ago. The scars of the past would always be a part of them, but they had found a way to move forward, to heal. Slowly, surely, they were becoming whole again. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter things, old family stories, jokes about the past, and plans for the future. There was a warmth to the conversation that hadn't existed before, a quiet joy that filled the space between them. Ethan had found his footing, and David and Sarah had found their way back to each other. There was still work to be done, still moments of doubt that would creep in, but for the first time in a long while, the future didn't seem as uncertain. They had made it through the hardest part, and together, they would continue to find a way forward. But even as they sat there, side by side, David couldn't help but wonder, would the scars of the past ever fade completely? Or was this peace just another fragile moment in their ongoing journey? The sun was setting over the small town as David, Sarah, and Ethan stood on the porch of their home, the air crisp with the promise of change. It had been years since they had all been together like this, standing side by side, facing the future without the heavy burden of regret hanging over them. The road had been long and painful, full of setbacks, broken trust, and moments when it seemed like the weight of the world might tear them apart. But here they were, together, at the beginning of a new chapter. The promise of the future felt both thrilling and uncertain, a delicate balance between hope and the lingering fear that the past could still catch up with them. David looked at Sarah, his heart full of gratitude. They had weathered the storm together, and though the scars of their journey would never disappear, they had found something stronger than the pain. They had found each other again. He could feel the shift in their relationship, the quiet strength that had developed between them over the years. They were no longer the couple who had fought in silence, too afraid to acknowledge their own hurt. They were a team, bound by the challenges they had faced and the healing they had worked so hard to achieve. "Can you believe how far we've come?" David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He was looking at Ethan now, his eyes tracing the lines of his son's face. There were no more walls between them, no more walls between Sarah and him. Everything felt different. The past didn't define them anymore. Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Ethan, who was standing a little apart from them, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his expression thoughtful. "It's hard to believe," she whispered, her voice tinged with wonder. "We almost lost you, Ethan. We almost lost everything." Ethan met his mother's gaze, and for a moment, his face was a mask of everything they had been through. The guilt, the regret, the fear of never being enough. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, stronger than it had ever been. "I'm not the same person I was," he said softly, the weight of his words settling between them. "I know I've hurt you both, but I also know I can't change the past. I can only show you that I'm trying to be the person I should have been all along." David felt a pang in his chest. His son, the same one who had once been lost, now stood before him as a symbol of personal growth. The boy who had made so many mistakes, who had hurt them both in ways they never thought they would heal from, was finally on the path to redemption. It wasn't perfect. It would never be. But it was enough. It was more than enough. "You're doing it, Ethan," David said, his voice thick with pride. "You're showing us every day that you can change, that you have changed. And that's all we ever wanted, just to see you try, to see you fight for yourself." Sarah reached out, her hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. She had come so far from the woman who had been unsure if she could ever forgive him. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice breaking, the tears she had been holding back finally slipping down her cheeks. "You've made it through the hardest part. You've made it, Ethan." Ethan's eyes softened, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for not giving up on me." The moment hung in the air between them, quiet but powerful. They had come through the fire together, and though the scars would remain, the fire had forged something new, a new bond between them all. It was a bond of resilience, of understanding, of knowing that no matter how difficult the journey had been, they were stronger for having walked it together. As they stood there, the evening sky deepening into shades of purple and gold, David looked at his family, his wife, his son, and realized something. The challenges they had faced had changed them, yes. But in a way, those very challenges had made them who they were now. Stronger, yes, but also more human, more real. They had learned what it meant to love through the hardest moments, to forgive when it seemed impossible, and to fight when they felt like giving up. "We've got a long road ahead of us," David said, his voice steady, though his heart was full. "We've all been through so much, but as long as we're together, we can face whatever comes next." Ethan nodded, his eyes focused on the horizon. There was a determination in his posture, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. He wasn't the same boy who had walked away from them in the past. He was someone different now, someone who had learned to stand on his own, but also learned the importance of standing together. Ethan's journey wasn't over. He had made amends, but his past would always be with him. The road ahead would be filled with challenges. Some he could already see, others hidden in the distance. But as long as he had his family by his side, he knew he could face anything. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice firm. "I'll keep doing the work. I'll keep making things right." David and Sarah exchanged a glance, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like a new chapter was opening before them, one filled with possibilities and hope. They had come through the hardest part. They had rebuilt their family piece by piece, and now, together, they would face the future. But even as they stood together, hopeful, a question lingered in David's mind. Would the road ahead be smoother, or would new challenges arise that they weren't prepared for? Only time would tell, but whatever came next, they were ready to face it, as a family. The table was simple, just a few plates of pasta, a loaf of bread, and a bottle of wine shared between three people who had fought harder than they ever expected to keep their family intact. The quiet clink of forks and the soft murmur of conversation filled the air. But beneath the ordinary, there was something extraordinary happening. The road they had traveled was long and difficult, filled with moments of fear, pain, and uncertainty. But tonight, as the soft glow of the candlelight flickered on their faces, there was peace. There was healing. Ethan, his eyes brighter than they had been in years, spoke quietly about the future. There were no dramatic promises, no grand declarations, but his words were filled with a steady, quiet hope. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next," he began, his voice low but steady. "I want to keep working. I've started to save up, to build something for myself. Maybe a small place of my own. I don't know yet, but I feel like I'm finally starting to understand what it means to live with purpose, to do things the right way." David and Sarah exchanged a glance, the pride in their eyes clear. This wasn't the same boy who had once thrown away his future. This was a young man, taking responsibility for his life. It wasn't a perfect path, not by any means, but it was real, and it was his. "We're proud of you, Ethan," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "The way you've turned things around, it's not easy, but we've seen you fight for this, fight for yourself, and that's all we ever wanted." Sarah smiled, her eyes full of tears she hadn't let fall. "You're becoming the person you were always meant to be," she whispered, "and we're so proud of you." Ethan nodded, his gaze dropping for a moment as the weight of their words sank in. The hurt, the shame, the guilt, they hadn't disappeared, but they didn't define him anymore. He had worked hard to rebuild, and tonight, For the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right track. This was his second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The quiet of the moment stretched between them, the weight of everything they had overcome, lingering in the space. It was no longer a burden. It was just part of their story, a chapter they had survived together. Later, after dinner, David and Sarah sat together in the living room, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background. The house was quiet, save for the occasional sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen, cleaning up. For the first time in years, it felt like they were just a family again. Not defined by the mistakes of the past, but by what they had built together, the strength, the resilience, the ability to move forward. Sarah leaned against David, her hand finding his, and for a moment, they simply sat in silence. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that only comes when you've been through something deep and painful and come out the other side stronger for it. "You know," David said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "I never thought we'd make it here. There were times when I thought we were too broken, but we're still here." Sarah's lips trembled into a smile. "We are," she said, her voice thick with the weight of the truth. "And we're stronger because of it. We've got a second chance. At love, at family, at everything." David kissed the top of her head, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had spent so long fearing that they wouldn't make it, that the mistakes, the hurt, would tear them apart. But now, as they sat together, he realized that the pain had only deepened their bond. They had fought for each other, for their family. And in the end, it was that fight, that determination, that had brought them to this point. As Ethan came into the room, his eyes meeting theirs, David felt something shift. The walls between them had crumbled. They were no longer just a family healing from past wounds. They were a family moving forward together. Ethan smiled, that same quiet optimism in his eyes. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "I'm ready to make the most of this." David and Sarah exchanged another glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Ethan had come so far. They had all come so far. The future, though uncertain, felt like something they could face together. They had learned the hardest lessons, the lessons of love, forgiveness, and patience, and they had learned them together. As the night grew late, the family sat together, wrapped in a quiet peace that felt foreign, but welcome. Ethan wasn't the only one starting anew. David and Sarah, too, were stepping into a future they hadn't dared to imagine a few years ago. A future where the past no longer defined them. A future where, despite everything they'd gone through, they knew they could survive, thrive, and find joy again. But as they sat there, knowing that the worst was behind them, a question still lingered in the back of David's mind. Was it enough? Was the journey truly over, or would the echoes of their past one day rise again to challenge them? Only time would tell. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The small apartment was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the modest space that had become his own. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with bare walls, a small kitchen, and a few mismatched pieces of furniture. But it was his place. It felt like a small victory, a tangible reminder of how far he had come. His hands were steady as he set the last box on the shelf. There were still moments of doubt, moments when he questioned if he was truly ready, but as he stood there, looking around at his new life, he felt a sense of accomplishment settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of the past on his shoulders. He wasn't defined by his mistakes anymore. He had worked hard for this, fought for this, and now he could finally say, "I made it." The phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a smile tugging at his lips when he saw the name. It was David and Sarah, his parents. "Hey, Ethan," David's voice crackled through the phone, warm and familiar. "We're outside, ready for the grand tour?" Ethan's heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. He opened the door to the apartment, stepping out into the hallway to greet them. His parents stood there, smiling at him with a quiet pride that made him feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Accepted. David's eyes scanned the apartment, taking in the simplicity of it all. There was no grand celebration, no grand gestures. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Ethan had done it. He had made the final step, the step toward independence, toward being the man they had always hoped he could be. "You've done it, Ethan," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out to him, pulling him into a hug, her arms tight around him as if afraid to let go. "We're so proud of you." Ethan stood still, letting the moment wash over him. The past, with all its messiness and pain, was fading away. In its place was something better, something he had built with his own hands. "Thanks, Mom," he said, his voice thick with unshed emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you both, without your support." David stepped forward, his eyes holding a mixture of admiration and love. "You've worked hard for this, son. We've always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself." His voice caught for a moment, but he cleared his throat, his gaze steady. "It's been a long road, but you've made it." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. The words weren't enough. They never could be. He had hurt them. He had disappointed them in ways he couldn't take back. But now, he was showing them that he was more than his mistakes. He was finally standing on his own. "I don't think I could ever repay you for everything you've done for me," Ethan said quietly, his eyes focused on the floor. "But I'm going to keep trying." The silence that followed was heavy, but not in a bad way. It was the silence of understanding, the understanding that the past didn't define them anymore. It was part of their story, yes, but it wasn't all of it. They had learned to move past it, to grow beyond it, together. As the evening wore on, they sat around the small table, the three of them sharing a simple meal. The conversation was easy, flowing between them in a way it hadn't in years. They talked about work, about the things they'd missed in each other's lives, about the small victories. There were no awkward silences, no uncomfortable pauses, just the quiet hum of a family that had finally found its way back to each other. David and Sarah exchanged a look across the table, a look of quiet relief. They had been through so much, and the weight of their own struggles had nearly broken them at times. But sitting here, in Ethan's small apartment, with the man he had become, they realized that they had been through the hardest part. They had healed, they had rebuilt. "We've come a long way," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with quiet reflection. "But I think we're finally there. We've made it through the worst of it." David nodded, his heart full. "We've learned a lot along the way, about forgiveness, about love, and about not giving up on each other." He looked at Ethan, his eyes softening. "I think we've all come out stronger because of it." Ethan looked at his parents, a quiet smile on his face. He had learned too, learned how to fight for himself, how to take responsibility, how to never take his family for granted again. They had given him the tools to rebuild, and now it was up to him to make the most of them. As the evening came to a close, the family stood together, the bonds between them stronger than they had ever been. Ethan wasn't perfect, and neither was the family, but they had made it through the fire, and now they were ready to move forward. But as they stepped out into the cool night air, David couldn't shake the lingering question in his mind. What would the future hold for them now? They had come so far, but the road ahead was still uncertain, full of unknowns. Yet for the first time in a long time, David knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The final step had been taken, but the journey was far from over. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm, golden light across the backyard where the family sat together, a sense of peace hanging in the air. It had been a long time since they had gathered like this, since they had shared a quiet moment, free from the weight of their past. The years had been hard on them, each challenge leaving its mark, but they had made it. They had come through the storm together, and now, in the quiet aftermath, they could finally breathe. David looked over at Sarah, her hand resting gently in his, and for a moment, they didn't need to speak. The years had changed them both, but in ways that had brought them closer together. They had survived the hardest times of their marriage, the uncertainty, the pain, the fear of losing each other, and had found something stronger, something that could weather whatever came next. They had found strength in each other, in their love, and in the lessons they had learned along the way. Across from them, Ethan sat with a quiet confidence. He was no longer the angry young man who had once lost his way. He had grown, not just in age, but in spirit. He had learned the power of redemption, and he was now helping others find that same strength. There was a calm about him, a steadiness that came from knowing who he was and where he was going. He had made peace with his past, and in doing so, he had become a beacon of hope for others who struggled as he once had. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faces of his parents. "I used to think my mistakes were what defined me. I thought they were the end of my story," he said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "But I've realized that the past doesn't have to be the end. It's just part of the journey." He paused, looking out into the distance. "Now, I get to help others who've been where I was, and that's something I never thought would be possible." David felt a swell of pride rise in his chest. It was one thing to forgive his son, to see him work through his demons, but it was another to see him turn that pain into something meaningful, something that could help others heal. "You've done more than just change your life, Ethan. You've shown others that it's possible to find redemption, to rebuild when everything feels lost." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "You've made us proud, son, more than you'll ever know." Sarah, her eyes misted with tears, smiled softly. "We knew you had it in you. You just had to believe it yourself." She reached across the table, taking Ethan's hand in hers. Her grip firm, but filled with tenderness. "And we've been with you every step of the way." Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her words. For so long, he had carried the burden of his mistakes alone, convinced that no one could ever love him again. But his parents had proven him wrong. Their unwavering belief in him, even when he had given them every reason to doubt, had given him the strength to keep going. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you both for never giving up on me." The moment stretched on, quiet and full of unspoken understanding. There was no need for further words. They had all come so far, and in this moment, they understood each other in ways that they never had before. David and Sarah exchanged a glance, a small, knowing smile crossing their faces. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. Their relationship, once fractured by years of strain and silence, had been rebuilt through their struggles. The love they had for each other and for Ethan had become the foundation of their family. They had learned the hard way that love wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. And now, here they were, together, stronger than ever. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, to future plans and new adventures, there was an undeniable sense of peace in the air. Ethan had found his purpose, his path, and was walking it with confidence. David and Sarah, though older, still found strength in each other, their bond now unbreakable, forged in the fires of their trials. Together, they had built something lasting, something that would outlast any struggle that came their way. Ethan sat back, his eyes distant for a moment, but his heart full. "I know I've got a long way to go," he said, his voice quieter now, thoughtful. "But I'm not afraid of what comes next. I've got the support of you too, and I'm never going to forget the lessons you taught me. The hard ones, the ones that made me who I am now." David smiled, his hand resting on Sarah's. "Whatever comes next, Ethan, we'll face it together. The past doesn't define us anymore. What matters is how we move forward." As the evening wore on, the three of them sat in the quiet warmth of the setting sun, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of love that only comes from having been through the hardest of times. There were still unknowns in their future, still challenges that lay ahead. But in this moment, they knew that whatever came next, they were ready. Ethan was ready to take on the world, and his parents, with their renewed strength and bond, would walk beside him every step of the way. As the light faded and the stars began to twinkle above, the family knew that the hardest part was behind them. They had built a legacy of love, forgiveness, and growth, a legacy that would carry them through whatever came next. But even as they sat in peace, the question still lingered. What new challenges would the future bring, And would they be ready to face them as a family once more? Only time would tell.